I recently watched a video called Writers You Need to Read More Nonfiction. I want to share a clip of this video and then share some of my thoughts on it.
So I think for fantasy writers in particular, reading a wide range of nonfiction can really bring depth to your world.
I agree, but this next part is what really rang true to me.
And I do get the feeling that a fair number of fantasy writers mainly just read other fantasy books, and a lot of them feel very much the same.
In this video, I'm mainly going to agree with this stance. I think some fiction is becoming too disconnected from reality when the authors are too inspired by other fictional pieces and not inspired enough by nonfiction and the real world. The case I'm going to make is when you are an author that is inspired by too many other authors and too many other works of fiction, your books are going to feel a little bit watered down because they are not as directly inspired by real life history, culture, economics, and political systems. And if we go back to the point where authors are primarily rooting their works to some extent in reality, we are going to have a lot more high quality literature. The original video talked about fantasy. I'm not going to limit my scope to just fantasy, but let's go ahead and start there. Watered down fantasy. I found a video from the Welsh Viking where he kind of describes that he feels uneasy whenever he picks up a modern day fantasy because he feels like the majority of these books, for some reason, incorporate elements of Welsh and Irish culture, but don't really get the essence of the cultures that they are sort of calling to.
Because whenever I see a fantasy book that has elements of Irish mythology in it or Welsh mythology in it, I generally go in assuming that they've got it wrong, that they have done no real homework on it.
He goes on to say that the majority of fantasy seems to be using elements of Celtic culture without really understanding that culture and without really understanding the differences between different Celtic cultures. Because of this, reading fantasy oftentimes feels jarring to him. That being said, he says there are some exceptions.
And there are authors that have done the opposite. There are authors that have done good work on it. And just from the bookshelf behind me, here's one. Professor Tolkien did a pretty good job of being inspired by Welsh.
J.R.R. Tolkien was an academic who was inspired by real-life cultures and events. He was also a gifted linguist that would study Germanic, Celtic, Finnish, and Greek mythology. He put his passion for those real-life topics into his books. Interestingly enough, a lot of modern fantasy authors are inspired by Tolkien and what he has written, or they are also inspired by people who were inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien. They'll oftentimes talk about their love for those particular books. I do think that there is a little bit of a danger here, not because there's anything wrong with being inspired by other authors and other pieces of fantasy, nothing wrong with that at all, but when you are so inspired by the fiction, you can oftentimes forget the methods that were used to produce the original work of fiction in the first place. If you're inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien and what he wrote, amazing, but you should also be inspired by his methods. His methods definitely included a lot of real-world inspiration, both from his musings on World War I and also his deep personal study of different world cultures. From watching his video, the Welsh Viking kind of feels like authors are not putting in the work to accurately portray, at least in spirit, the sort of cultures that they are putting in their books. Now, of course, fantasy is fantasy, and you're going to switch things up for your book, but there's definitely a different feeling between someone who understands the roots of what they are pulling from and someone who doesn't. Now, while he thinks people are doing this on purpose, I don't know if I totally agree with that. I don't know if it's always purposeful when a fantasy author takes some sort of vague fantasy concept that has been passed down through generations at this point and doesn't necessarily feel rooted in reality. It could be that a fantasy author today is pulling from what is now normal for the fantasy genre, which comes from people in the past who had studied these cultures and put them into books. But the new authors are not pulling directly from the cultures or directly from the real world. They're pulling from other fictional pieces, leading to this watering down effect. So rather than the authors not being purposeful in what they're doing, sometimes I wonder if they even know they're doing it at all. I do think an author can take inspiration from reality and go in a completely different direction and take a lot of creative liberties and change a lot of things up. But as a reader and as someone who enjoys things that feel real, I would rather these deviations from reality and from the feelings of reality be purposeful and not accidental. And I don't want to paint the picture that no fantasy authors are ever pulling from real life events to give more grounding to what they're doing. Here is Brandon Sanderson talking about his inspiration from the Mongols.
The Alethi are based off of the Mongolians a little bit. One of the key influences is this idea of when the Mongols took over a big chunk of China and then became a dynasty in China. And being these people who were conquerors who had to turn into running an empire or running a kingdom, that's how I view Dalinar.
To be fair, as someone who has taken a little bit of time to study the Mongols, I really didn't need the Mulan footage on the video, no offense to the editor, but the point still stands. It's not just fantasy though. Let's discuss the watering down of historical fiction. Witches are trending. People like witch stuff right now, which I kind of have no problem with. I do kind of buy into the idea that witches in history represent feminine power. There are a lot of really interesting cultural nonfiction pieces on that. But when anything is really popular, there are people who get it wrong. Here's Elizabeth Wheatley.
The medieval church never burned women for witchcraft. It was not a thing. It was never a thing. It never happened. I do not know why historical fiction authors are so obsessed with this thing that is totally made up.
She's correct. Burning witches didn't happen in the medieval period. It didn't happen until after that period. Yet we tend to have a lot of medieval historical fiction pieces of the medieval church or people in that sector burning witches, even though that never really happened. I can't help but think that sometimes some historical fiction writers are inspired by other pieces of historical fiction to the point that they feel like they have a vague understanding of the time period that they want to write in and that they want to set their story in. But because they aren't pulling enough from actual history and from actually researching the time period they want to be portraying, their works end up being a lot more fictional than they ever meant them to actually be. This doesn't, by default, make the book bad, even if it is inaccurate. We'll talk more about that later. I have another pet peeve that fits this topic. Lots of people love Jane Austen, partially because of the love for Jane Austen's works and for the love of that type of fiction. There have been a lot of people who have written pieces of historical romance that are in that time period. They're inspired by Jane Austen, and they're inspired by her works and by her character work and by the relationships that she has in her books. The problem is sometimes authors are inspired by Jane Austen and read all of Jane Austen and read a lot of other pieces of fiction set in that time period, but they aren't as focused and obsessed with, well, Regency England. In Regency England, there was a social practice or social norm regarding introductions. You didn't just introduce someone to anyone. When you introduced someone to another person, you were sort of tying them together in an acquaintanceship for life, and this was taken very, very seriously. Oftentimes, if you wanted to introduce someone to another person, you would go and ask permission beforehand so that they sort of had consent to that lifelong acquaintanceship. It's not like today where introducing someone to someone else is not really an issue. It was always done very purposefully and with a very clear intent. So in Pride and Prejudice, there is this character called Mr. Collins who introduces himself to the main male character, Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy is Mr. Collins's social superior, and going up and introducing yourself to a social superior in the time period was just unheard of.
When in reality, Mr. Collins introducing himself to him, he's acting like he's the social superior. He's like, I'm so superior. I can introduce myself to you whether you want to meet me or not. And that would actually be incredibly insulting in the era.
That little act said a lot, yet a lot of modern day Pride and Prejudice fans think that Mr. Darcy is being rude and standoffish in this scene. They think that Mr. Darcy is being full of himself, and the fact that he acted weird and a little bit confused by this happening just proves that he is a standoffish guy. In reality, when Jane Austen wrote that passage, she was meaning for Mr. Collins to look weird and like he was discarding social rules because he did something that is just never done. And those little cultural nuances add a lot to her works. Many historical romances that try to mimic the power dynamics and the feelings of Regency England, especially within a romance story, have read her works, but they misunderstand what's actually happening in a lot of little subtle scenes. And because they are more inspired by the fiction pieces themselves and not by studying Regency England to the same extent, some of these books feel a little bit watered down. They're trying to create the same effect as the originals, but they fail to do so, not because they don't love the originals and not because they don't have good writing, but because they don't understand the context of their favorite scenes, and that is definitely going to come across when they write a historical romance piece themselves. Is this new? The concept of getting inspiration from other pieces of fiction for your own piece of fiction is by no means new. It's not like it's this unique 2025 problem. I'm not trying to come across that way. I guess in an ideal world, since we are living in a time with tons of access to information, I would hope that people would look at that information before writing a book that could use that information. When a medieval storyteller would tell a story about a distant land, I can kind of excuse the fact that it's going to be very, very fictional and based off of that person's biases because they didn't really have access to a lot of information. They used what they could, which was not all that much. In the modern day, when we have access to crazy amounts of information, even free and easy to access information, I would hope that a lot of people would understand how much depth they can give to their book by rooting some ideas in reality. And to be fair, you can pull from real life experiences. If the book you're writing is going to be very close to your real life, a setting close to your real life, a time period close to your real life, using your real life experiences but written into a piece of fiction, maybe you don't need to do as much research because you kind of have an idea of the time and place and feeling. But if you are hoping to have some sense of reality to your book, even if it's a fictional piece, but you're setting it in another time period, or you're creating a brand new fantasy world, it's probably a good idea to do some research about how different things work, whether it be the time period in the case of a historical fiction piece, or even just how political and economic systems function if you are making your own society in your own world in sort of a fantasy piece. Doing this sort of work might be the boring part of writing, but it is going to set you apart from other people who are copying other authors who did that work. Even people without a lot of money do have access to information, and if you use that advantage of being willing to do the work, you are going to benefit from it later. An example of an alternative. Books do not have to be dense and boring and complicated to avoid the watering down effect. To go with another genre, this is a 2025 release that I read earlier this year called Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zhang. This book, in addition to being written during the COVID pandemic in New York City, which of course is an easier time period to cover because a lot of us have direct experience with these sort of events, in addition to doing a really good job at portraying little details that really show the time and place, it also follows ideas of the Hungry Ghost Festival from China. So the character is doing a horrific ghost story, but pulls direct ideas from a really deeply rooted historical practice, making this ghost story a lot more rooted in what feels like a cultural practice than something that is fully made up. Now, does she take no liberties? No, that would be boring. It's important that you also take an idea from the real world and change it to fit your story and do something to make it interesting. You are writing a piece of fiction, and this is a cultural piece focusing on the Hungry Ghost Festival. So that is clearly fiction because, well, I guess I don't really believe in ghosts, and you can believe in ghosts. I don't know the author of this book well enough to know if she took most of these things that she included in this book from her real lived experience, or if she did a lot of research and incorporating some elements in a new, fresh way. But regardless, this was a very easy to read book that was not dense and not complicated, that felt like it had a little bit of grounding in reality and a little bit at least of a cultural grounding. Does this even matter? So even if I've convinced you that some books are written by authors who have done some research, and some books are written by authors who are inspired mainly by fiction, does that really even matter? Does a book have to have direct real-life inspiration to even be a good book? Funny enough, I don't think it's a requirement. I think an author can do something that is very incorrect technically, like having the medieval church burn witches, but still do a good job with the story. The character work of a novel is more important than the setting, in my opinion. If you have an engaging character who has real grounded motivations and has interesting dynamic relationships with the other people in the book, you're going to have a good book regardless of the cultural surrounding or the setting of the book. I would even go as far as to say a book with good character work, but terrible understanding of history, culture, politics, and economics is going to be a better book than a book that does have an understanding of those things but doesn't put any effort into the characters. This is an opinion. However, I do think that it is better when a book has both. The books that sit with me the longest and I think about after I close the last page tend to have a little bit of both. Grounding your story in reality because of your passions and because of the things that you have studied that are real from the real world is going to make your book better, in my opinion. This doesn't mean that you can't change anything. Taking ideas and structures and ways of thinking that have come from real life people, real life cultures, real life history, and then morphing it into something unique, especially if you're doing something out there like a fantasy novel or a horror novel, is where I think peak creativity is at. I would just rather you take your understanding of reality and do this on purpose, not accidentally include things that you don't even know that you're including and not know about the time period or about the setting that you are portraying. Rather than only being inspired by fiction, I think that authors should have really healthy appetites to learn about real world events, real world politics, real world culture, and, well, just reality. Let me know what you think. Do you think that this thing is real? Do you think some authors get inspiration from other fiction rather than getting inspiration from things they're passionate about from the real world? And if that is true, does it even matter? Thanks for watching.